Country people seem to know better than our friends and relatives in Adelaide the importance of our connection with the world around us, whether through the food we eat or the air we breathe. Welcome, I'm Perry Strathern, and with me are Family First Senator Bob Day, Labor MP Nick Champion, Liberal Senator Anne Ruston, Senator Nick Xenophon, and Greens Senator Robert Sims. Welcome. This evening we're talking about the environment, and there's one world-changing issue in this area, which is climate change. What should Australia be doing about it?
Well, we need to take action on climate change, absolutely. And, you know, it's very clear, I think, for people living in the regions that we need to do something. The Greens have been advocating for an ambitious target to move us towards renewable energy. We're pushing for 90% renewables by 2030 nationally and 100% renewables by 2030 here in South Australia. And we know that in taking action on climate change, we can create thousands of new jobs. And so in South Australia, that would mean, of course, giving the green light to solar thermal in Port Augusta, but also looking at a whole range of other renewable energy technologies that can be made here in South Australia. Wind, solar, but also harnessing the skills of our state's manufacturing sector to create new jobs. So from our perspective, we need to see investment in renewables being driven by the federal government and being encouraged by the federal government, and we can create new jobs in that process.
Wind turbines, are they a part of our future, Bob Day?
No, they're not. Look, let's be clear about one thing, and that is that climate change is not about science, it's about politics. And there's an awful lot more to climate than CO2. I spent quite a number of years in the science field, and all the evidence and from around the world now of those who are totally opposed to the so-called consensus, which there is none. There is no consensus when it comes to climate change. And CO2 has actually been very, very beneficial. Over the last few years, we've seen record crop productions, record food production, a greening of the planet. There is no link at all between CO2 and climate change.
Do we have any consensus among our other representatives today?
Well, the consensus is the science is in. I fundamentally disagree with Bob. But back in 2009, when Malcolm Turnbull was opposition leader, we jointly commissioned Frontier Economics to come up with an alternative emissions trading scheme, an alternative approach that would have been greener, it would have been smarter, and it would have been cleaner overall. So I think the challenge is, how do you maximise the environmental benefit whilst minimising the economic cost, particularly in relation to electricity prices? You need to have an intensity-based model. I think that's important. But at the same time, we need to drive those flagship innovative projects such as solar thermal in Port Augusta.
Anne Ruston, where are we up to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's two sides to this. It's what the government's doing to set the agenda and to encourage industry out there about what the future is for renewables and how we're going to deal with issues of the environment. I mean, obviously the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is a classic example of a government with cross partisan support has actually put in place something that is beneficial for the environment. So I think they're the things that government can be doing. But I need to pay commendation to our farmers. Our farmers are amazing. They come up with these extraordinary adaptive practices where they actually make the changes. They are best placed to understand what needs to be done so that we've got sustainability into the future. Not just because their economic future depends on it, but because they're close to the land. They see it day in, day out, what the changes are occurring on their land, and they're best placed to make those changes. And so I think the huge investment in research and development, particularly in our agricultural sector, the increased funding that we've put in as a government is tremendously important, because I think if we can keep ahead of the curve and support our farmers in doing the things that they need to do, that is how we're going to address any changes that occur within our climate, far better than governments coming out with big sticks and putting big picture policy in place. We set the agenda and we let the farmers particularly deliver on much of this stuff.
Would a Labor government have a bigger stick, Nick Champion?
Well, if you look at what the government did, they got rid of the emissions trading system, and what happened was emissions went up and investment went down. So that was hardly a winner. and they didn't receive much political benefit out of it either. If you look at the Greens, they talk a great game, but they failed to back a Labor government before the 2010 election actually introduce an emissions trading system. And had they voted with us on those occasions, we would still have an emissions trading scheme today, and it would have been in place and operating. And again, Nick is well-meaning, and Nick's team is well-meaning in this area, but again, too many cooks spoil the broth. We had a very good emissions trading system. It was working, emissions were going down, investment in clean energy was going up. I think that's the sort of program we need to get back to. Good investments in renewables, an emissions trading system. Labor's the only party that's been an honest broker in this area, and I guess as a last resort report, Bob's in a minority of one in believing that climate change doesn't exist.
Being called well-meaning is maybe the ultimate insult during the election campaign. Jeez, you know how to hurt somebody, Nick. But this situation, when the Frontier scheme came out, it was described by Penny Wong, who I have a great degree of personal respect and regard for. She described it as a, quote, mongrel of a scheme. Well, a few weeks ago, Labor came out with their policy in terms of the stationary electricity market, which is almost identical to the Frontier scheme. So it seems that in 7 years, the mongrel has become top dog. So I think we actually need to look at what is going to work best. I think we all want to maximise the reduction of greenhouse gases, or most of us want to maximise the reduction of greenhouse gases and do it in the most economically efficient way possible.
We could just pick up the point that Nick Champion raised about the ETS. You know, that was something that was negotiated between Labor and the Liberals, and it would have locked in failure. And that's why the Greens voted against it. But then when we were in minority government, we were in a position to negotiate getting a carbon price, putting a price on carbon, which made Australia a leader in this space. The Liberals came in and they ripped it up, and we've seen what's happened to investment in renewables since then. And let me just say, on the issue of Bob Day saying that climate change doesn't exist, I mean, next is going to be telling us the Earth is flat. I mean, really, there is a scientific consensus on this, and it's time to take real action to address climate change.
Look, both, I mean, to be misrepresented like that and verbaled by both Nick Champion and Rob Sims to say that I said that climate change does not exist is totally false. Of course climate change
man-made
exists,
climate change.
but to suggest that it's being caused by CO2, which is an inert gas with 0.0% of the atmosphere, is ridiculous. We've known from when they used to grow grapes in England and wheat in Greenland and all sorts of so throughout the last 1,000 years, we know that the climate does change. It has been changing for thousands of years, but for us to all of a sudden think that now we are controlling the climate because of CO2 emissions is what I dispute, and so do thousands and thousands of scientists.
So more of a long-term weather variation, you would say?
It's caused by all sorts of activities of the sun and many other factors, but not by the emissions of CO2. In fact, one volcano eruption in Iceland is equivalent to the emissions of every car and every human on the planet for about 10 years.
Well, speaking of the long term, I'll turn to nuclear waste. What do you each think about the proposal for a nuclear storage facility in South Australia?
Is this low level or high level?
Well,
There's two proposals.
there are two proposals. Do you have a differing view on each of them?
Yeah, I do.
Anne?
Yeah, and I've been on the public record only last week in saying that I think that South Australia, as does every community, has a responsibility to deal with its low-level nuclear waste. You know, the isotopes,
generated by hospitals
gloves,
and so on.
Exactly, the gloves, the scissors, and the like that have been generated as a result of treating cancer patients. So I think that we do have a responsibility to deal with our own waste, and the smartest thing for us to do with that waste is to make sure that we put it in the safest possible place. So geological conditions will determine where the best place for South Australia to deposit its low-level nuclear waste. In regards to the decision by the South Australian Government to pursue an analysis of high-level nuclear waste repository for South Australia, which deals with the world's high-level nuclear waste, I think is something that we do need to have a very careful look at before we proceed with. Certainly both the Liberal Party and the Labor Party federally have said that the jury's out. We'll wait and see what the South Australian Government comes back with before we make any decisions on it. But it would be remiss of me as the Assistant Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources not to say that I think that we need to have a very careful look about our clean, green, safe image internationally, which is where our competitive advantage comes when we sell food, when we make that decision. So I just think that we just need to be very careful about what Australia is projecting itself is and what the potential perception for the rest of the world might be should we decide to turn ourselves into a high-level nuclear waste repository.
Do you have a similar view, Nick Champion?
Well, I think low-level waste from our hospitals, there does have to be a national repository, and it makes sense to go through that site selection very carefully and in a manner that is not partisan, appropriate consultation with communities and the like. And I think there's probably a broad consensus in the community about that very low-level waste that's currently stored in our hospitals. In terms of high-level waste, Labor's platform is pretty clear about opposing such propositions, and I think we have to be kind of carefully look through the results of the Royal Commission in that regard. I think some of the fears about clean and green need to be taken account of, but we shouldn't forget that France has nuclear reactors and still has a world-class wine industry. So, but I think we do need to be obviously cautious about this idea of an international nuclear dump. You would be transporting nuclear waste from one end of the globe to the other, and that seems to me to be a pretty difficult proposition.
So Labor's generally opposed to a high-level dump unless proven
state
otherwise.
or federal Labor though?
Well, the federal Labor's platform is pretty clear, and that's binding on everybody in the Labor Party.
State Labor have got a pretty different position. I mean, you know, it's interesting
Well,
that Nick
they
says.
haven't.
Well, it's interesting that Nick says that, but then
They've
his
had a Royal
state
Commission.
counterparts have initiated this Royal Commission at taxpayer expense to basically move our state down this nuclear path. The Greens are really concerned about this. We don't support South Australia becoming the world's largest nuclear waste dump, and that's what would happen if this project went ahead. We don't think that the business case is there. You know, if this was really going to generate billions and billions of dollars, then why has no one else in the world thought of it? The reality is, if we go down this path, we are going to put our reputation as a clean, green state at risk. We have a really good reputation for local quality produce, and I'd rather have South Australia gaining a reputation for making gluten-free cake than yellow cake. We should be building on the skills that we have in those sectors rather than risking it with this nuclear agenda. And let me say just finally, the other issue here that's often forgotten when we talk about nuclear waste is the impact that that has on remote and regional communities. And a few months ago now, I travelled to Hawker and I met with the traditional owners of the site that's been proposed, and I also met with local members of the community. It's very clear the traditional owners don't want to see that area turned into a waste dump because of the cultural significance of the land and the impact that that has on Aboriginal culture. But also members of the community, local farmers, local landholders don't want to see the project go ahead either because they're really concerned about what it means for the reputation in their area, land value and so on. So we do need to think very carefully about this, and the Greens have been on the front foot arguing against this nuclear approach.
Very quickly, Bob Day and Nick.
I'm trying to be quick. Debunking green myths is forever. But the last point before this one about suggesting that I want to return, a flat Earth. No one throughout history ever thought the world was flat. Even the ancient Egyptians knew it was round. They just didn't know how big it was. So just put that one to bed. As far as the nuclear sector goes, once again, it is not a dump. Wingfield is a dump. Most rural towns have a dump, a waste dump outside of their towns. We all know what a dump looks like. This is a nuclear waste repository. It's an extremely sophisticated structure underground, very, very well secured, and I think this would be a great opportunity for South Australia to say have an office of the International Atomic Agency, International Atomic Energy Agency in South Australia overseeing this. There are a number of countries in our region that are using nuclear power. I think it would be a tremendous diplomatic coup for us.
It'd be a coup, I reckon, but not a diplomatic coup. Can I just say that this, in terms of a low-level repository, it's actually low and intermediate level waste from Lucas Heights as well. There needs to be community consensus. There are real issues about the process in respect of Hawker. I know Andrea Broadfoot's been doing a lot of work with the local community there, our candidate in Grey. But the other issue is that in terms of a high-level nuclear waste dump, repository, whatever you want to call it, it's a big call, and it's something that will define us as a state for thousands of years to come. I actually find myself in agreement with this unlikely coalition of the Greens and the Liberal Party in relation to this. I'm really worried about the impact it'll have. I think it's very important that you don't have an alliance at the state level of Labor and Liberals saying we're going to push this through. At the very least, there must be a referendum of all the people of South Australia, and right now I'd be voting no. And now, lastly, we did touch on this in a previous episode on the River Murray. I know Bob Day was on the Senate committee which explored this issue. There seems to be this sense that in some parts that there's a disagreement between upstream irrigators and downstream South Australian recipients of water. Bob Day, where do you stand? Very quickly.
Well, the evidence for when I attended all the meetings right throughout the entire Murray-Darling Basin, the general view is that everyone upstream is a thief and everyone downstream is a whinger. And it's been clear that the Murray-Darling Basin plan has not worked. It definitely needs adjustment. There are some areas that are starved of water. Communities are being destroyed. It was sold to us on the basis of the so-called triple bottom line of social, economic and environmental benefits to the Murray-Darling Basin. And it seems like 90% has been just focusing on the environmental benefits, nothing on the economic and social impact on towns and communities throughout the basin.
Nick Champion.
Well, we went through a pretty extensive community consultation and parliamentary consultation process with the plan, and of course it originated under John Howard. It was John Howard who really instigated, without cabinet discussion, Malcolm Turnbull was the minister, and it was carried on, into the Rudd and then Gillard governments. Look, nobody's arguing this is an easy process. It's actually a pretty difficult economic and social bit of policy. And I worked up on the river in my youth, so I can remember picking apricots and peaches every summer from 16 onwards till I was about 21. So I understand the economic wealth it creates. The peaches and apricots were off to Singapore.
Are you happy with the basin plan as it stands?
Well, I think, look, no plan is perfect, and Bob's and sort of talked about military analogies, but you do have to stick with the plan. Once it's made, you actually have to stick with it and implement it, because it's an important bit of national environmental and economic policy making, and it's important for the country. And one last point. My only Labor predecessor, one of my only Labor predecessors, first question to Menzies in the House of Representatives in 1946 was a question about the River Murray. So we know this is not a new problem. It's not without contention. We've just got to get it done now.
Nick Xenophon.
Look, with climate change, it's a particularly pressing issue. I'm hoping that the rain we heard on the roof above us is a good sign of things to come for this season. Water allocations have been reduced. You need to have a healthy river system, but also a healthy economy. You need to get that balance right. Of course, the Murray-Darling Basin plan isn't perfect, but it's the best we have. It was hard fought. There was a lot of toing and froing between the major parties and crossbenchers. We need to stick with that plan. Of course, there's nothing wrong with what Bob has suggested by constantly reviewing it, questioning its effectiveness. But right now, I don't believe we should be ripping it up.
Robert Sims?
Yeah, I agree with Nick Xenophon. We certainly shouldn't be ripping up the plan. You know, the Greens have always been of the view that we need more environmental flows in line with what the Wentworth Group has recommended. But that said, we have supported the plan because we recognise that reaching consensus on these matters is difficult, and this is a good stepping stone in terms of getting us to where we want to be. But we're going to continue to advocate for more environmental flows. So I think it has been a plan that's delivered positive results for South Australia, and despite some of the issues with it, I'd hate to see us going backwards. We should really see the discussion now moving on to how we can guarantee more environmental flows, not less.
And from the Riverland, Anne Roston.
Yeah, well, I am an irrigator and obviously see firsthand the implications. And I have to say that the decision to open our water year with 36% was unnecessary. I think we could have reasonably opened it at 55 or 60% if you have a look at the amount of water that's in storage. But that may well all be a moot point now that we've seen quite a lot of rain in the catchment. But what I would say is that this is a tremendously ambitious and complex thing that we're trying to do here. Not only does the federal government go through a process of negotiation to enable the plan to be implemented or legislated for in the first place, but we also have to continually get the agreement of every one of the states that are affected for anything that we do. So I think it is very dangerous, and I think it's irresponsible for us to think that we should start tearing up or making major changes that would jeopardise the plan now when the plan is barely partly implemented. We had a wonderful process that we've gone through to enable us to get in excess of probably 450 gigalitres of water as adjustment, which means that no longer do we have to take that water out of productive use. We can actually achieve it by sensible measures that we put in place that would deliver us the same outcomes without adding water. We've got another round of that coming up in July 2017, where we hope to get it in excess of, or at least up to 650 gigalitres, which will mean that the amount of water that we're taking away from our farmers and our irrigators and our regional communities will be 650 gigalitres less than was originally projected in the plan. I think what I'd like to see is allow the opportunity for us to be able to work our way forward and to implement the things that we are and the positive things that we're implementing before jumping in and just trying to tear up a plan because we've had some low inflows over the last 12 months. This problem has been exacerbated because of the lower inflows, but hopefully we've seen a break in that rain. We can see some higher inflows and we can have a sensible conversation without everybody becoming hysterical, because at the end of the day, if we don't have a healthy and sustainable river, none of our river communities will be in existence into the future.
That's all we've got time for tonight. Thank you for watching. We'll be back for one more episode tomorrow when we'll be talking about people and our society. We'll see you at 7:30 on your local Fairfax Media website and on social media. Until then, good night.